Good morning, party people. You want to see something cool? How cool is that? It's a pen. So when you push the little thing in and it does the crab, it also puts the ballpoint pen in and out. It's just one of those little oddball things that when I was in Alaska, I look for oddball souvenirs, and then they end up cluttering my entire rack of stuff over here. It was just so adorable. I just totally had to have that. Frag King says it looked like a weird toothbrush at first. I suppose it could be. What was it that Adam Savage said? Every tool's a hammer if you try hard enough. I suppose every tool is a toothbrush too as well if you try hard enough. Default Blame Acceptor says, good morning, is there a backyard update? There is. It's so funny. My dad and stepmom are here visiting from Michigan, and we all went out to dinner last night, and as we're pulling out of the driveway, we saw a huge stack of stones, big pebbles piled up in the driveway, and what had happened is the landscaping company came and dropped off all the river rock that they're laying on top of the landscaping. Didn't tell anybody. I just have a whole huge pile of rock sitting out in front of my house. Well, the alleys to get into my backyard, they're only wide enough that you can fit a wheelbarrow through and nothing else. So all morning they have been out there filling wheelbarrows with buckets full of rocks and then wheeling them back into the backyard to start laying them out. I can't wait to go see how that looks. Super excited. They have also started texturing the concrete, so it's starting to make all kinds of huge progress. I think we can kind of see the end of the finish line, but see the finish line, period. But at the exact same time, they're also so late that they had to file a thing with my HOA explaining what their new estimated finish line was, and it was like August 16th to September 1st. They're like, it's the worst case, just in case. And I was like, no, that it could be worse than that, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was. Oh, I tell y'all what, there are a bunch of really good questions in the PollGab queue. I usually look just to make sure that there's nothing offensive or see the end of the finish line. Yeah, DK, come on. And I Freudian slips there that we're on the finish line, but we got another 3 weeks to go. There's so many good questions in the queue. I usually go through and just see to make sure that there isn't something offensive or something that I just flat out don't want to answer, that I look at stuff and I go, I'm never again answering any questions about fragmentation. People can just go Google that. D. Sanchez says, in the near future, will there be an office hours backyard edition? Absolutely. There will be a backyard edition and a garage edition. I'm starting to set up the pieces of camera gear around the house in different ways so that I could do that, but I'm absolutely totally going to do that. I also liked, when I traveled through Iceland, I did them remotely. I really like giving y'all a change of scenery. Now, normally when I do a change of scenery ones, they're not live, but in the garage in the backyard, I should be able to live stream those. And I don't have any big travel plans coming until the end of August. The end of August, I'm going back to Iceland just for like 4 days for a road trip, getting a camper. Then I fly to Oslo, I think. It's either Oslo or Gothenburg. I do a SQL Saturday in each of those. I'll do office hours recorded from there. Then I'm doing a cruise up the coast of Norway, Hurtigruten cruise off along the shore, and I can't wait to do that too as well. I'll do videos from there as well. Should be a lot of fun. So let's go and get into your questions. Let's see here. The number one, Groove Timer says, hey Brent, I'm trying to convince my employer not to do in-place upgrades. Due to cost constraints, they're making me do it. Are SQL Server in-place upgrades still ill-advised? Yes, absolutely, because the outage is longer and you have no backout plan. If all hell breaks loose, you're going to have to restore the server from backup. And even when you restore it from backup, it's a ticking time bomb, because whatever made the upgrade not work will probably make the next attempt at an upgrade not work either. So the whole problem here is that your company thinks that in-place upgrades are cheaper. So here's the way that I say it to companies, because companies ask me to do in-place upgrades too. The way I respond is I just say, look, I make mistakes. I'm a human being. And I haven't done an in-place upgrade from like, say, 2012 to 2016 or 2019, because these cheap companies, they usually want to jump several versions. I haven't done an in-place upgrade across those versions. I don't know how long it's going to take. So here's what I need you to do. If you want to do an in-place upgrade, I'm with you, but what I'm going to need you to do is I'm going to need you to restore that server under a different name so that I can go work on it live or in an isolated network environment. And I'm going to try the upgrade process. It may not work the first time. It may take several times. And each time that I do it, I am going to be writing up a documentation on here's what I had to do in order to make it work. Here are the pitfalls I ran into. Here's how I'll make sure that we don't run into those same pitfalls live. So I may have to do this several times, and you're going to have that server up, the backup of it up, while I'm working. So if you think that's going to be cheaper, that's actually more expensive than just building a brand new server of the version that you want and log shipping over to it. Your call either way, but then usually they're like, what, can't you just do it live and say YOLO? No, I can't do that in production servers, unfortunately, when it's a task that I've never done before, because you're going to think that I'm going to get it right every time, and I just don't know if it's going to work until I actually try it, because some in-place upgrades don't work. That helps people understand what's going on. Adam says, I've always likened that analogy to changing jet engines while they're in flight. It might technically be possible, but it seems scary. Yeah, and there's nothing to be gained from it either. If you want a new jet, you can just land it, go walk over to the other one and take off. You'll be up and running in no time. Whereas if anything goes wrong, you're kind of screwed. Next up, StuckInAQuagmire says, have you ever had a situation, whenever I hear Quagmire, I think of, that's the character's name from Family Guy, right? Like, giggity, giggity. He's pretty awesome. Now, you ever ran into a situation where a stored proc took so long, the app reran it without stopping the original, and it cascaded into a zero resources problem, and the only way to fix it was to stop SQL Server? Yes. You asked a yes or no question. You got an answer. Yes. Hopefully you also learned something there. Not only did you learn that the answer was yes, you also learned how to better ask a question. What information did you want next? That's probably the question that you should have asked. Now, because I'm feeling exceedingly generous today, I am going to ask the follow-up question that you should have typed in there to begin with. When this situation happens, what do you do? What you do is you log into the DAC, the Dedicated Admin Connection. The Dedicated Admin Connection is a separate scheduler and memory that's set aside just for emergency troubleshooting. Then you can do things like killing queries if that's necessary. The other thing that I would do is I would say to the application, because this is a common problem that people run into, people will just hit refresh on a web browser when the query is running too slow, and then that creates a cascading set of problems. The other thing that you want to do is you want to work with the developers to put things into a queue, for example. If there's a possibility that you can have a storm of people hitting refresh, you want to check their existing sessions, cancel their existing queries. They're one of my favorite clients. Whenever they hit execute on something that would take more than a couple of seconds, they submit it to a queue. So the next page has a little spinner that says you're number X in the queue in order to run. Then that way, if the user even hits refresh on the page, it goes right back to their queue and says, hang on, you're waiting, you're now number X, and they can kill their query if they want to. Now, granted, that is a spectacular amount of work. That is not an easy amount of work. It's going to take time to implement, but if you want that solution, that's one way you do it instead of manually jumping into the DAC. Next up, Bomi asks, Bomi says, I watch your office hours constantly. Love your teaching pragmatic database usage. Thank you. Woo! but I've never used SQL Server. You're not alone. I've heard that from several people. I've also heard from people who used to do SQL Server work that they're like, well, I don't do SQL Server work anymore, but I still like watching your streams. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. Is there a Brent for SQLite or MariaDB or Postgres or something? As far as I know, no. And what I mean by that is I don't know anybody for those platforms who does live streaming, puts stuff on YouTube, publishes multiple blog posts a week, has script libraries for you to go through and use. I do a whole lot of free work so that when you need paid help, you'll come back to me for that. So I don't know of anybody who does all of that. I know people who like blog or do YouTube streams now and then, but I don't know somebody who does all of that. So there you go. Bomi continues on, should I just start using SQL Server just because it has the best learning material? I wouldn't say it has the best learning material, but it has the easiest to do yourself. The other platforms like Postgres, for example, you can Google Postgres tutorials and there are hundreds or thousands of them out there, but it's just kind of a collection of set of tools and it's up to you to go through and put all those tools together in a way that makes sense for you. It's a lot more about self-learning instead of having someone else spoon feed you all the time. I'm not saying those platforms are bad. I mean, like I use Postgres too myself, but it's just I wouldn't use something just because there's easy to use learning material on it because you may not be able to get a job with it. So there you go. Howdy, G-Surgeon. Bob the Lobster says they just dial in to watch me roasting. I could believe that too as well. Peter came to an interesting topic. Peter says, I've just learned about query notifications. This was something that came out in like 2005 or 2008, and it hardly gets any buzz at all. Peter says, normally I'd use event hooks in an app to raise notifications of data changes, but this query notifications would be useful when the data can be changed outside of the app. What are the drawbacks and gotchas? Well, the reason that you haven't been hearing much about it is because there are so much drawbacks and gotchas. If you have multiple application servers, each of them is going to have to open a query notification session monitoring for changes in the data that they care about. Then, to make matters worse, you're probably going to open one for each table because there are going to be several tables that you care about. Then, when you open one on a frequently modified table, let's say, just to say products, something that changes all the time, you're only going to open one query notification to span all of the products, but then a product will change all over the place and your app is then going to refresh all of the data, not just the one row that changed. So you end up with this storm scenario where every application server has a query notification set up for every possible table, and every time a row changes, it's all, go get it, and all the application servers bum rush the SQL server. It's like a distributed denial of service attack. So then over time you start to learn, well, maybe I should break those tables up into ranges, like one query notification for the first 1,000 products, the second 1,000 products, the third 1,000 products, and so forth. But then you have so many query notification sessions set up that it ends up draining connections dry on the SQL server. You start running into memory problems, for example. So it didn't end up catching on before the day and age of caching instead. What would be cooler is if you had a central caching service, like something like Redis or Memcache, where all of the cacheable data was there, and that thing would have query notifications set up, so it would just pull once and then help all the app servers get faster data. But unfortunately, that's just so much work that nobody does it, so kind of fell out of favor there. Next up, .NET Dev says, hi Brent, it seems like Azure SQL DB doesn't allow me to set cost threshold for parallelism. Do they automatically modify this? No. Microsoft still doesn't publish guidance for what cost threshold for parallelism should be. SQL Server has been out for over 2 decades now, and Microsoft still hasn't published guidelines on what that setting should be. Psst, people like Randolph who work for Microsoft, and you say that we're complaining about the documentation. This is what we're complaining about. Welcome to 1999. So people need to set cost threshold for parallelism because SQL Server doesn't set it automatically. Microsoft's stance has kind of been like, don't worry about it in Azure. We'll figure out how to take care of it for you. And I'm like, when? Right after we figure out this MaxDOP thing. So unfortunately, it's just one of those things. Adam says, I'm starting to think that Microsoft doesn't know. And in fairness, not only do they not know, they don't have a systematic way to figure it out either. They don't have a systematic way of setting it. So I'm kind of disappointed that you can't set it in Azure, but then again, at the same time, I feel like Azure SQL DB was targeted at small databases first, and small databases tended to run on like 1 to 4 CPU cores, so cost threshold for parallelism wasn't a really big deal then. These days, with Azure SQL DB instances going up to like 80 CPU cores, it should seriously be revisited. PyroCat says at least Microsoft made most of the documentation amenable via an approval route now. Yes, but I would humbly suggest that I don't want to do volunteer work for one of the world's most valuable companies, especially when it's something like cost threshold, where any yo-yo can propose something and then there becomes this big old arm wrestling match of what's the right number. So, and that cost threshold would be a great example of that, where I can see Microsoft going back and forth in order to figure that out. I love that there is GitHub pull requests for the documentation. I just think that Microsoft still owes the community basic setting guidelines for things like cost threshold. And Adam says, and it's also for software that costs an arm, a leg, and 1 kidney. I agree. Most of the SQL servers that I work with are either $1 million and up. They tend to be fairly large enterprise edition boxes. So because of that, I'm like, hey, for $2 million, can we get some documentation, please? To cover basic setup stuff. Asks, what is your opinion of the new snapshot backup support in SQL Server 2022? Is this the answer for multi-terabyte database backups? Well, for snapshot backups, for like SAN snapshot backups with VSS, this has been out for like 2 decades now. It's maybe 15, 16 years, I think. It's not a new thing at all. And it's been a great answer for multi-terabyte databases for that whole time. The part that's new is the ability to just tell SQL Server, I need you to freeze I/O for a second. But that doesn't take a backup. All it does is freeze I/O so that something can take a backup, and it's still up to you, dear reader, to integrate that with something, whether it's Azure's volume snapshot support, Amazon's volume snapshot support, or so forth. So I think it was a good feature, and I'm glad that they did it. It just doesn't do anything by itself. It's a tool like a hammer, and if you wanted a house, like a multi-terabyte database backup is kind of akin to building a house. Microsoft just gave you a hammer. It's still up to you to get the nails and screwdrivers and all these other things and actually build the house. Kevin asks, good morning, Brent. This may seem trivial. I'm a little leery about moving Management Studio versions. Are there any gotchas that you know of? So what I do is I run virtual machines. I like to use something called a jump box. You have a VM that sits in your data center or Azure, wherever it is that you're working. A VM that's got SQL Server Management Studio installed, and I RDP into there. So then that way, if I want multiple versions of software, I don't mind setting up multiple jump boxes. I could set up one with older tooling, one with newer tooling. Because sometimes Microsoft removes support for stuff. For example, in I think 19.2, they removed, there's like a security assessment thing they removed, and stretch tables, I think, out of the GUI. Frag King says V18 and V19 can be run side by side, and that's true. I always get worried because 19 will upgrade some shared components, and I've run into problems with that when I had like ODBC connectors that had to go to wacko versions of stuff. So my personal favorite is just to run multiple RDP sessions for that. That's what I like to do. Two jump box VMs. Kris asks, hi, in SQL Server 2019, is there a way of running dynamic SQL for over 8,000 characters? Yes. And Vercare Max. So when you declare the size of your nvarchar variable, you can, and dynamic SQL is supposed to be nvarchar, so the max size on that is 4,000 characters. But then you go to nvarchar max, and you can have like 2 gigabytes or something of dynamic SQL. You can absolutely pass that in. For example, in SP Blitz Cache, we have queries that go way longer than 8,000 characters, that go like 32,000 characters. So check out nvarchar max. And that SP execute SQL, of course, you want to be using that as well. Slonik asks, DK Kimbo says he may be running into the print issue, so it looks like it's concatenated. That's absolutely true. If you the print string function has a max of 8,000 characters, but it also accepts an offset. So you can say print the first 8,000, now print the next 8,000, starting at 8,001, and so forth, which is exactly what we do in SP Blitz Cache. Slonik asks, what are your favorite Postgres blogs? I feel terrible with this answer, but I don't subscribe to any. I only subscribe to one. And the one that I subscribe to is Postgres Weekly, I think it's called. Postgres Weekly is a roundup of like the best news in the Postgres business. So that's much, for me, it's like nice that someone curates a bunch of the good stuff in there. That's not true. I also subscribe to Depez, I think is how you pronounce it. But Postgres Weekly is the place that I would start. Michael J. Swart says SP execute SQL does support nvarchar max, but the common pitfalls are to try to concatenate several columns which can truncate. That's absolutely true, and I'm glad you mentioned that. What happened to me all the time was I didn't cast things as like nvarchar max. I would just concatenate strings, and they would end up chopping off, which was, or I would switch in between. Some of them had the N prefix on the string and some of them didn't, and I would run into problems there with the concatenation on really long strings too. Stupidity. Next up, Psycho Killer asks, what is, now I'm going to be singing that all day, Psycho Killer. I just watched a really good 60 Minutes interview with a talking head guy. What is it, David Byrne? David Byrne had a great interview. It's out on YouTube, the official interview from 60 Minutes. Really insightful, brilliant fellow. Says, what is your opinion of the hybrid buffer pool and PMEM support in SQL Server? So let's set the stage. The year is 2023. I don't have a lot of clients left that are building new SQL servers on dedicated physical hardware, running it on bare metal. I have a few, but most of them, what they're doing these days is they're moving either towards the cloud or they're already in virtualization, where a VM can move around from one host to another in order to avoid problems with host hardware. So I think this is one of those features that kind of got left on the vine because people, or left on the vine is what I mean by that is that the feature was available and just no adoption hit because the timing wasn't quite right. I think if that supporting hardware and the capability to use it in SQL Server had been around 10 years ago, it might have been a different story. 5 years ago, people could have used it, but the adoption still would have been, dying off quickly. And I think it probably even came out in 2017 or 2019. But when it came out, I was already like, who's building physical SQL servers that needs that feature? Because if you need that, if you're building physical SQL servers, and putting dedicated bare metal directly on that SQL server, installing Windows on it and layering in SQL Server, then what most people are going to do is they're going to just stuff the box full of RAM anyway. So they're going to put in, it sounds crazy, but 512 gigs, 1 terabyte of RAM or more. These days, you can get a Lenovo laptop with 128 gigs of RAM for less than $4,000. Now, granted, $4,000 sounds like a lot of money to spend on a laptop, but remember, for 128 gigs of RAM, I don't know how much longer SQL Server is going to be able to say the standard edition only supports 128 gigs of RAM, because that's getting to be pretty popular now. Next up, CJ asks, since SQL Server Agent alerts aren't available on managed instances, is there a list of items we should monitor through the portal? Any resources you can provide will be great. Managed instances, there's a technical term. It's called expensive. Expensive. Like the kind of expensive that people will substitute a $ for the S's, you know, like how they do with Microsoft. Every now and then you'll see people go M and then $. Microsoft's so expensive. Because of that, because it's so expensive, monitoring software seems relatively cheap. Most monitoring software is around about $1,000 per monitored instance. For me, I would just as soon go get third-party monitoring tools, especially when I start committing to, say, $50,000 a month in expenses on managed instances. I start looking at actually getting monitoring software because it's trivially inexpensive relatively. Dom asks a related question. What would be the most important features you would see as a requirement for a monitoring tool? I have a great way of doing this. I'm so glad you asked. I have a great way of doing this. When a client is thinking about buying a monitoring tool, I say, I want you to go back through the help desk through the last like 3 months, and I want you to make a list of the outages that you had that you wish the monitoring tool would have told you about as early as possible, and that the monitoring tool needs to make it easy for you to troubleshoot that problem. Let's say that you have an out of drive space error. Or let's say that you have a blocking that cascades and you run out of worker threads. Make a list of those. How many times does it happen? And then when you go evaluate monitoring software, simulate that exact scenario. Have someone fill up the drive. Have someone start a blocking firestorm. And then see how it feels in the application. See how in the monitoring front end. See how easy it is or hard it is in order to solve that problem. That will help you understand what that monitoring tool is good for. Because really, all the monitoring tools out there for SQL Server monitor roughly the same stuff. It's about how easy or hard the user interface is for you to work with. Because I got some clients who are like, oh my God, Brand A is so easy for me. And then other clients are like, oh my God, are you kidding? Brand A is a piece of junk. I love Brand Z. And that goes back and forth. I don't have a horse in this race. To me, they're all kind of a pain in the rear to use. But if you resonate with one, there you go. Eduardo says, do you know of any good tools that parse the query plan to extract the parameters and parameter values to use in SSMS? Yes, SP Blitz Cache. SP Blitz Cache gives you your top 10 most resource-intensive queries. And one of the result sets out there gives you the exact parameters that were used. You can just click on it, and it gives you an exec call stack that you can just put right directly into SSMS for testing. Works beautifully. I use it all the time. And it's free. Kanya says, not Kanye, this is different. Kanya says, what is your opinion of Azure Synapse? Every 3 years, Microsoft renames their analytics tools. It's happened over and over for the last 15, 20 years. Every 3 years, Microsoft has this product that all of a sudden enters from stage left, and they're like, hi, I'm Azure Synapse Analytics. And Eugene Meidinger has a great name for this. He says, this product is actually a stack of raccoons in a trench coat. And as soon as you see it moving around, you start to see the trench coat open, and you're like, wait a minute, that's just a stack of raccoons. And that raccoon stack gradually shuffles off the stage, and then another raccoon stack slides on. Hey, everybody, I'm Microsoft Fabric. And the things like barely holding together, and it's not really a cohesive vision. It's just a whole bunch of different raccoons that are all trying to get into your trash can. I don't have a lot of faith in that. I look at Microsoft's competitors. DK Kimbo says they're all just clippy. I look at Microsoft's competitors, and they seem to have a much more consistent execution. So if I was in the analytics business, I would probably be looking at other products, things like Redshift, like if I was going to bet my career on it, because I wouldn't want to bet my career on something that keeps shuffling in and out every 3 years. Now, I'll give you the alternate point of view. The alternate point of view comes from consulting companies. Consulting companies see what Microsoft does and goes, oh my God, we could make a fortune teaching people how to use products and get them implemented. And then just when we're done with the project, the raccoons will be gone and we'll get a whole new set of raccoons and it won't be our fault. We can say, we'll keep working on it for you with a new set of raccoons. And so consulting companies and evangelists love that kind of thing because they make money forwards and backwards. Adam says, I feel like Microsoft just changes names every few years to keep them in the press. Yes, I also feel like they do it because there's no positive brand recognition with the old brand. If you have really positive brand recognition from something, you don't take the name away, but when it isn't going so well, you keep shuffling the names around to make it look different. Big J Pop likes my shirt. I just got a bunch of new shirts from Moon Shots, so I'm all excited about those. Let's see, there was another chat message I missed. Eli said, I love the sip as punctuation thing that Brent does from time to time. I like that too. I have a really good time with that. Let's see here. We got one new question too just came in, so I'll hit this. Brandon asks, I've seen your article on 3 connection strings for scaling transactional systems. What do you think are the best options now for providing read-only replicas for the near current and older connection strings? Still the same as when I wrote the post. Near current, the best option is always on availability groups, readable secondaries. Older connection strings, the best option is still log shipping. And I don't expect either of those to change anytime soon. We'll do one more. Aditya, actually we'll do 2 more. There's another that's really cool. Aditya says, when should you use async auto update stats versus sync auto update stats? So sync is the default, and what that means is when your read query hits, when your query goes to read stuff from a table or insert, update, delete, whatever, and SQL Server looks at the stats and they're out of date, SQL Server says, hold up, I'm going to reread the statistics and build a new execution plan. Then we'll run that query plan for you. Okay, that's cool, but if you have a really large table, and especially if you set persisted stats sampling to read the whole table, it could take a really long time. So what async auto update stats does is when SQL Server looks at your statistics and says, oh my gosh, these are out of date, async says, I'm going to update these, but you go ahead and run with the query plan that you have. There are 2 different schools of thought about that. One school of thought is, well, you're going to let them run with a really crappy execution plan, but maybe it's not that crappy. After all, it was working for a while. Plus, at least it can start running right away. The sync camp says it's more important to have accurate stats to build a good plan and then take off running. I really don't care either way, because you know what? I've never had a performance emergency that was solved by turning async on, because I've never seen it where queries were continuously waiting on stats updates and the answer wasn't to change the stats on that table. I'll give you a great example, a queuing table. It's very common for applications to have a queue table where sometimes there's 1 row in the table, sometimes there's 1,000 rows in the table, and it churns through continuously. So as a result, every hour or 2, those stats are out of date because the quantity of rows in the table has changed so much. Why are we even updating stats? Just update stats once when the table has, say, 1,000 rows in it, whatever the max number is, and turn off update stats on that table altogether. Set stats on that to no recompute. I don't want to ever revisit it again. Rebuilding execution plans for that is a waste of time because it's always just going to be churning through. That is my preferred solution to objects where the stats change all the time. Now, I'll also tell you though, I've never in my career had a time when I turned off async stats updates and it made anything better. If you want to run with that on, that's completely okay. I don't have a problem with it. I've just never used it to personally get myself across the finish line. So there's one other, and this was another one of the ones that I thought was really interesting. So Eram asks, what is your opinion of the Microsoft announcement for support of .NET 5 C# language extensions for SQL Server? Okay, now normally when someone wants to run app code in the database, the default Brent Ozar answer is no. App code belongs on app servers because app servers are, carry the one, free. App servers don't have SQL Server licensing on them. SQL Server licensing is the last place that I want to run somebody's expensive C# code. But let's pretend you do. Let's pretend that you want to run C# code inside the application server. Let's see what this is. So we'll switch over to here. So I'm going to pop open a web browser. Also, I'm going to change the window so you can actually see it here. Where is that window? There it is. There we go. So let's go get that URL that this person, that Eram put in here. Let's go get this announcement. So Microsoft says back in September of 2021, Nikita Takru, who I'm sure is a very nice person and completely competent, I don't know her. I assume that, joking aside, everyone that I know at Microsoft is way more competent than I am, so take that for what it is. We are thrilled to share that we are open sourcing this language extension for SQL Server on GitHub. Okay, what is it? Let's go click on it. So, all right, the last commit was in February of February 17th. Let's go to the history. These are all the commits from the last 2 years. You know how every now and then in a Western movie, you haven't watched a Western movie in a while, but your grandparents would watch these a lot. You would see tumbleweeds rolling across the screen to indicate you were kind of in a ghost town, that nothing was going on, and you'd hear music like, you know, like lonely whistling music. If this GitHub repo had a soundtrack, that's exactly what it would sound like. So would I use this? I don't think that I would. Adam says, on the other hand, it's such good software that there have been no bugs in 2 years. That's true. And also, if you go look at the issues tab, there are 4 issues. One of them opened more than a year ago, has no response from Microsoft. So I would not want to bet anything in my company on something like that. There are generally 2 reasons why you open source something. One is that you're really proud of it and you're continuing to work on it, but you want to work on it with the garage doors open. You want to show everyone what they're doing, and you want to take pull requests from other people because it's super active. Microsoft's Books Online is a great example of that, or Microsoft Learning, whatever, you know, of course they call it different things every year. Microsoft Learning is a great example of that. Lots of people can contribute stuff. The other reason why you open source stuff is you go, hey everyone, if you want to use it, here you go. And then you kind of shuffle off to stage right. And you don't have to say that you discontinued the product, but the stuff in there kind of speaks for itself. All right, so there we go. There is office hours for today. I'm going to go stumble downstairs and go see what my backyard is looking like, because this whole time I've been hearing them shovel stone up into buckets and carry them. God, these guys are heroes. It is currently, that can't be right. It should be hotter than that by now. Yeah, it is. It's still only 84. This week it's supposed to get up to 110 in Las Vegas. Las Vegas has set a record for the most number of days without going to 100 degrees. And so we were at like 270, I think. It was the longest period of time Nevada had, or Las Vegas had ever gone without hitting 100. That is about to break this week big time. So I'm going to be out in the backyard handing out waters all the time because these poor guys are amazing. Jane Estia says, I came in late. Were you looking at a library that makes SQL and C# play nicer? Well, no. And you'll see why when you watch the archives. So, all right, thanks for everybody for hanging out with me, and I will see y'all tomorrow on the next office hours. Adios.